Consider this. While half the world's population lives on less than $3 a day, the combined wealth of the world's 200 richest people tops $1 trillion. Across the globe, the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. For generations, some of those who are wealthy have shared their riches for public good. And today, individuals and companies are looking for ways to be good philanthropists. But can philanthropy do enough? Or is it just scratching the surface of implacable poverty? These questions and more, next on Great Decisions.
In a democracy, agreement is not essential, but participation is. Join us as we discuss today's most critical global issues. Join us for Great Decisions. Great Decisions is produced by the Foreign Policy Association, inspiring Americans to learn more about the world.
Funding for Great Decisions is provided by the Star Foundation and U.S. Trust.
Last year, billionaire investor Warren Buffett, the world's second richest man, donated the bulk of his fortune, $31 billion, to a charitable organization. That organization was founded by the world's #1 richest man, Bill Gates. It's believed to have been the biggest charitable donation in history. And every penny is needed. There are the 25 million Africans with HIV and AIDS, the 27,000 children who perish every day because of poverty, hunger, and preventable illnesses. Carbon emissions and the environment, education in the developing world, safe drinking water, the list of needs goes on and on. Today, more money is available for philanthropic causes than ever before, and there is no end to the list of famous people lending their star power to these causes. Rock star Bono has met with presidents and prime ministers all over the world in an effort to draw attention to poverty in Africa, among other issues. TV talk show host Oprah Winfrey made headlines when she opened a school for girls in South Africa, committing to providing college educations to the entire student body. Hollywood stars Angelina Jolie and Brad Pitt capture attention with their philanthropy in Africa.
There's been an enormous effort that I think Bill Gates has touched off of paying attention to Africa and to the most needy parts of the world.
No one can argue that these philanthropic efforts are making a difference for some. But can the world's most tragic and widespread problems really be solved through philanthropy? Or are those problems really byproducts of a system that places so much wealth in so few hands to begin with? According to one study, the entire world's sanitation and food needs could be satisfied for only $13 billion. Given the billions devoted to philanthropy and war, not to mention official government aid, $13 billion hardly seems to be an insurmountable number. So could this be about more than just dollars and cents? And what, if anything, beyond philanthropy can be done to ease the pain, suffering, and indignity of so many people all over the world? What about new schemes for raising and distributing charitable gifts through internet-based programs reaching millions of people with smaller fortunes? Philanthropy, the rise of global giving. Next on Great Decisions.
And now from our New York studios, here is Ralph Begleiter.
Welcome to Great Decisions. Joining us now to help discuss these issues of philanthropy, both American philanthropy and international giving, are Carol Edelman, Director of the Center for Global Prosperity at the Hudson Institute, and Kathy Bushkin-Calvin, Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer of the United Nations Foundation. Welcome to you both.
Thank you. Thank you.
I think a lot of people think of philanthropy as something governments do, foreign aid. We dump millions and millions of dollars abroad and so on. Is that an accurate picture anymore, Carol, about international aid?
Well, that has been the perception, and we started measuring private giving several years back with our Index of Global Philanthropy, and what we found was astounding. We found that private giving, and that's the giving of foundations, corporations, religious organizations, the charities, universities and colleges, and even the individuals who send remittances back to their countries, that private giving is now almost 3.5 times what our government foreign aid is. And I think it really points to the fact that Americans tend to give abroad the same way they give at home, more through private institutions, more people to people, where they can have hands-on experiences and be involved to help change things.
That seems to go against a little bit the idea that many Americans have that we shouldn't be sending a lot of taxpayer money abroad and so on. There's always a constant stream of resentment about that. Kathy, are you finding that too, that people are doing it through private donations rather than through government?
I think there's a misunderstanding about how much money the government even sends abroad. It's not that large. And Americans are very generous, so I think they assume their government's doing more than it is. But increasingly, I think Carol's absolutely right. People feel that there's a role for them internationally as well as domestically. It's been harder because you weren't always certain how to make sure your money got to a place where it was going to do some good. But I think everybody's now aware that they're global citizens. And the tsunami, I think, had a giant effect in terms of people's awareness of things happening around the world affecting them, and feeling that they had a responsibility to help out as well. So the tsunami showed a tremendous power of the individual to partner with governments to make a difference. And now I think people are starting to say, I could do that in lots of other places, girls' education, sanitation, you name it. Where can I make a difference?
You know, you mentioned the tsunami. That also gave a big boost to the American image abroad afterwards. Right. And that was an unexpected development at the time when the U.S. image abroad wasn't so great. Is that something you think that is motivating private givers in the United States? Carol?
In the sense of the image, you mean? Or
what it's going to do for the United States generally as a kind of kickback in a way?
Yeah, I don't know if that's a primary motivation, but I think that everybody does realize that when Americans can send their money, but also send their time. We have so many volunteers that go over, interact with people in developing countries so that people can see, you know, that we're good people and generous people, and that we really want to help, and we do that by when we go over as volunteers. So it does have that effect. In fact, for the tsunami, by the way, out of the all of the aid, they've calculated that now at about $13 billion. The U.S. private sector gave $2 billion of that, as opposed to less than $1 billion for our government aid.
And then Katrina happened after that, and we did even more, which is quite amazing. And I think the combination of giving and acting is actually a shrinking gap. It used to be maybe you gave and maybe you were a volunteer. Now I think people see it's a whole continuum, and they start with one activity and it leads them to another. And churches have been phenomenal in stepping up their engagement. And organizations like Rotary International, which has raised $600 million to combat polio, which is almost now eradicated around the world, but they send money and they volunteer to actually do the campaign.
Something else I wanted to ask you about is I think many Americans think in terms of charity as something you do at home.
Right.
But both of you are involved in organizations that deal with international giving. Is that a new trend? Is it something that's been going on a long time we just haven't noticed? What's going on?
Well, there's clearly an increase in international giving. It used to be very small, and it's still small compared to the amount of giving at home. But I think increasingly people feel that their dollars go further when they can do them internationally. You can really make a difference with a dollar when it's international. And there are many, many more organizations now that make it easier to do that, whether it's giving money through CARE, Save the Children, the UN Foundation where I work, all of whom make it possible for an individual to have his or her dollars go somewhere and to have the comfort that they're going to be delivered effectively. I think aid effectiveness is a big issue, particularly internationally, and there's a lot of work going on in that area now that I think will make the trend even greater.
How can you be certain that when you give to an international charity or a foundation that your money is actually being put to use in the way that you imagined it was going to be put to use? Are the checks and balances in place?
Oh, sure. I mean, there's a lot of organizations out there. One is called Charity Navigator that you can go to and see what an organization's overhead is. But I would encourage people to really go and talk to the institution, go on their website, ask the institution about what results are you having, and really find out what they're doing. And that information is so much more available now through the internet and all the websites out there.
Right. And, you know, I think simple gives or simple asks, whichever way you want to think about it, are increasingly available in international giving. We run a campaign called Nothing But Nets, where Nothing But Nets, and it's about mosquito bed nets to protect a child from malaria. Malaria is the biggest killer of children in Africa, and a bed net can save a child's life. And so there's a simple campaign, send $10 and save a life. That's very appealing. We've raised $13 million. It was on American Idol. A lot of our donors are people who haven't ever given internationally before. It was started by a Sports Illustrated columnist, so he reached a whole different audience than the typical one. Young people are involved, and people get it. It's a very simple delivery, and they can understand the benefit of a bed net. So I think increasingly there's also a whole range of those kinds of opportunities for giving where you can really get involved and not just give money, but even help raise money.
You've both touched on something I'd like to follow up on just a little bit. Carol, you talked about the Internet and the use of the Internet to find out about a charity. And Kathy, you talked about small gives, a $10 gift to buy a bed net. On the Internet these days, there are all these tools. A couple of them are called Kiva, another one's called Causes. They're on things like Facebook and MySpace, where a user can just click on Kiva and make a loan, a really small loan, $1, $5, $10, to some charity that's going to do good work. Then they get the money back and they can reinvest it in another charitable gift if they wish to, or they can join a cause and support it and spread the word about it. Many of these gifts are very, very small, $1, $2, not the sort of thing that amount to millions and millions. Are these new technologies, is this doing something new, or is it such small potatoes that it doesn't really matter in the scheme of global giving? Carol?
Well, we measured, actually, we tried to capture what this giving and other charities were raising. This is even separate from foundations, and we found that this actual kind of giving came to at least $13.5 billion.
Billion dollars?
$billion. And our foreign aid program for the same year was $27 billion. So and that's just the charities, not even churches or whatever. So it's making a difference. And what I love about it is that you can, when you're giving online, most of these organizations like Kiva, another wonderful group called globalgiving.com, allows you to go see the project and allows you to follow what progress is going on in the project. And anybody going to that country can visit it and go online and say, hey, this project was working, or no, I just saw, you know, Madame Nwanza driving off in a BMW with dead chickens around. Your project isn't working. But so there's a great new transparency and an openness and an efficiency, because it only costs Global Giving 5% of your grant to send it overseas, whereas a normal contractor working with AID is an overhead of 100%.
AID is the Agency for International Development, a U.S. government.
Our government aid program, yeah.
So is this also reaching more people, more individuals, or are you reaching new people who maybe couldn't give $1 million or couldn't give $100,000 but can give $10 or $20 or $100?
Right, absolutely. And it all starts there. Everybody sort of starts with small gifts and then eventually learns more about what's their passion and which kinds of giving matter to them and where they might see a role for them further on down the road. It's also great for the charities, because the Internet is a far more cost-effective way to raise money than direct mail and all the other things that add enormous costs into the process. It's still a small percentage of total giving, as we know, but it's, you know, I think in the tsunami case, it was a third of all the gifts. So clearly where there's an opportunity and there's awareness of the place to go online to do it, and now as people are getting the experience more and more, I think we're going to see lots more of it. And clearly with the younger generation, this is tapping not only their desire to give, but to get involved. And, you know, hopefully people will become not only donors, but advocates for change and advocates for greater government money if they think that's important, or policy changes and attention to the details.
But Kathy, I got to ask you this. I mean, the younger generation, an old guy like me talks about the younger generation, they're much more trustful of clicking on the web and donating some money through some internet site. Somebody who's going to give a larger amount of money isn't going to just click on something on a website and put the credit card number and say charge $1 million to it. Are the checks, is the watchdog in place on the web really in the same way that it is with, let's say, a government agency, where people who are held accountable for those gifts have to come back and say, okay, it's working, it's not working. It's not just people going out there and saying, oh, it looked good to me. Isn't there some skepticism we have to have about these new technologies?
Well, I think you have to have a lot of skepticism about not only the technologies, but about the philanthropy on the ground. I think that's part of this new environment, though, where you get to be engaged in finding it out, and you're responsible for making some of those due diligence checks yourself. But as Carol said, there's plenty of places that offer that assistance now, and there are many good organizations that are well known and you could work with as well, whether it's our organization or some of the bigger NGOs like Save the Children that we know do great work out there.
Carol, you do the Index of Global Philanthropy in your organization, and I think a lot of people look at philanthropy and they see Angelina and Brad touring around Africa, and they think that this is really, where the money is, and this is making a big difference. What's the result that you've come up with? Who's doing the giving? Mm-hmm. How much is it? What's making a difference?
Well, we don't have a separate number for celebrity giving, but it's out there. And I make a distinction with celebrities by, are they actually giving their money to a project, or are they just saying everybody else's government should give?
Right.
I think that a lot of them are going around saying government should increase, and then you look, well, are you doing any philanthropy? And they may not be, and they might even be evading taxes from their government, as one famous celebrity is. But I know Angelina is giving, and Oprah has a wonderful project in South Africa, and we highlight these projects because we think that celebrities should put their money where their mouths are, where their beautiful hair is.
What about big corporate givers? Some famous examples. I'm thinking of Ted Turner or Bill Gates, the founder of Microsoft, who came to philanthropy, I'll say, a little bit late. It took them a while to realize they first had to amass their fortunes, and then somebody talked to them about, well, why don't you spend some of this on charitable works rather than on building a fancy new house or something like that. Ted Turner set up the UN Foundation. How does that happen? How does a guy like Ted Turner wake up one morning and say, I'm going to give $1 billion to the United Nations and set up the UN Foundation?
In Ted's case, he had been a philanthropist for some time and really believes that people should give during their healthy years and their working years. They shouldn't save philanthropy for the end of their life or their will. And actually, he's encouraged some of his fellow millionaires that that's a way to think about their lives and their work and the whole schedule of their giving. And I think we've seen a lot of the newer generation get involved. Steve Case, Bill Gates, lots of these guys are doing philanthropy as part of their mid-years as opposed to their later years. In Ted's case, he cared deeply about two issues: nuclear weapons and population control. Those are two issues the UN does a lot of work on, and he felt this was an institution that our country wasn't supporting effectively, and he wanted to put his money where his mouth was. He was telling our government to do something, and he said, I'm going to step up and support it and urge others to as well. And so a large part of what we do is not only advocate for the UN, but actually encourage others to join us in working with the UN on the global causes that they do. And we've seen a tremendous increase in the number of companies who want to be participants in helping with clean water or health or public education or health. I think all companies are recognizing that this is important for their brand equity, for their customers, and for their employees to get involved. So that's a great new trend.
So you just put your finger on something interesting, which was that Ted Turner saw the U.S. government and others were not supporting the United Nations, and he said, they need the money, I'm going to give it.
Right.
Let's talk a little bit about this government versus private conundrum, if you will. Great Decisions asked Jessica Matthews, who's the president of the Carnegie Endowment in Washington, about which one's making a difference. Is it government giving or is it private philanthropy? Let's listen to what she has to say.
This kind of money has the potential to set a goal and stay with it in a way that government has more difficulty doing, particularly international assistance, which gets covered with barnacles by Congress saying, do this, do this, do this, do this, and there isn't enough money to do all those different things. I think it's too soon to say whether it's made a difference or not, but it's important work, and it over time will make a difference.
So do you think that that's an important issue, the idea that government restrictions of various sorts are placed on aid from governments, whereas someone like Ted Turner or Bill Gates or others who choose to give to something can say, no rules, or I set my own rules, I'm not going to set the rules set by the government? Carol, does that make a difference in giving?
It sure does, and I headed up our foreign aid program to the Middle East and Asia and then Eastern Europe when the wall fell, so I've had a experience on both sides of this barricade, which is, I think, no longer a barricade, which is nice. And government aid, the problem with government aid is wonderful people, well-meaning people, but they have to, too often they have to go through governments. Even if they're giving to an NGO, they have to go through a government approval system. And so the aid is, it's less, it's harder to tell if it's working, the evaluation hasn't been good. I think the model for government aid, because I'm all for government aid, but the model should be that government aid should be leveraging private money. And what do I mean by that word? I mean that I think the government aid dollar should never be the only dollar on the table. It should always be working in partnerships with private projects. Bill Gates does this.
Right.
The UN Foundation does a superb job of this, where it's Ted Turner's money and the foundation's money working with UN money, working with corporate money coming in. And all of those groups together are, if you will, to my mind, that they're passing a kind of market test. It helps government aid pass a market test. If they can work with a project that has been able to raise private money and private volunteer time, it's pretty likely that project is going to last beyond their contract.
But we can't let the governments off the hook because there's now new private money in the marketplace, whether it's governments or churches or foundations or individuals. The problems are so huge. And I think there was a fear early on with the Gates money being so large and then the Buffett money added to that, that, well, this would just make it easy for governments to step back and say, fine, they'll take care of the problems. And we can't let that happen either. It needs to be a partnership or it won't work. I mean, the problems are just so large, no one sector can handle them all anymore. So I think, and I do think foundations also have to be able to work with governments on the ground, which is a whole different challenge for a lot of foundations that haven't had to do that before.
Is there another danger, too, that maybe the sexy charities, if you will, to use an incongruous term, will attract the private money and the government will be left with the problems that are insurmountable, where the needs are so great that it's impossible to achieve a good result? Essentially cherry picking by private donors, leaving to the government the most intractable problems. Is that something we have to worry about?
I don't think that's a big problem. I think maybe that's actually a good thing. The government should be the one that steps in and handles some things if it can be offset and there's some money coming in because bed nets are fun and easier and simpler for people to raise money for. And drugs aren't, for instance. So that could not be a bad thing. I don't know. What do you think?
Right. Well, I think another problem with government aid that relates to this is that we've too often given it to big contractors or expensive consultants
or corrupt governments.
Or corrupt governments. So a great new book out by Paul Collier from Oxford called The Bottom Billion, where he shows that a grant that the UK gave to Chad, 1% of that grant actually made it down to the village, you know. So we have to be, in all cases, all of our aid, whether it's private or government, has to find the local partner and work with that local partner, not with the contractor over here, who has a greater incentive to have a long-lasting contract than a long-lasting institution or development in that country.
Let's talk about trends for just a second, kind of prospects for the future. We've seen a decline in government assistance over the last couple of decades, gradually, not only in the United States, but elsewhere as well. We've seen an increase in private philanthropy, as Carol mentioned at the beginning of our program. Now we're on the verge of people of my age, the baby boomers, coming of age, inheriting the money of their parents, the wealth of their parents. It seems to me there's a bit of a tsunami of potential giving out there. Talk about how's that going to unfold? Are the boomers going to give it away, or are they going to buy a yacht and a golf course and sit on their rocking chairs or whatever? Kathy?
Well, I think the jury may still be out on that, and part of our job is to make sure that there are some really attractive opportunities for people to give. But I think increasingly people are looking for effective ways to give. They're not. I think this generation is unique in that it doesn't want to just write checks. It's going to want to solve problems. And those sound like maybe they're the same thing, but I don't think they are. And so increasingly the standards for achievement, for delivery of charity or philanthropy are going to get higher because this generation is going to require it. But then I think they've got the dollars to drive those changes. And so the two are going to have to go hand in hand. I think the other thing is we're not the only country going through this, and increasingly we're going to see philanthropy in other countries, which has not been the case in the past.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd like to talk to both of those. One, I think this is not your mother and father's nonprofit world anymore.
Yeah.
It's totally different. It's venture, what has been coined venture philanthropy, philanthrocapitalism. It's people in business coming in and saying, I want to use business techniques to this project, and I want to make sure we're evaluating. I want to see what our ROI is, even if they might be doing it from a nonprofit institution. So we're seeing a completely different kind of philanthropy out there. And secondly, one thing we have measured in our most recent index is that European giving has completely exploded. In fact, 2/3 of the foundations in Europe now have developed over the last 20 years. Yeah. So that it is happening, even though their governments tax them to death. Some of those tax regimes are changing and allowing more giving, and it's growing. So that's very exciting, too.
Carol Edelman, Director of the Center for Global Prosperity at the Hudson Institute, and Kathy Bushkin-Calvin, Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer of the United Nations Foundation. Thanks to you both for being with us. And thank you for joining us on Great Decisions. I'm Ralph Begleiter.
To learn more about topics discussed on Great Decisions, visit our website at www.greatdecisions.org. To order a copy of the Great Decisions Briefing Book, a DVD set of this series, or to join a Great Decisions discussion group in your area, contact the Foreign Policy Association. Funding for Great Decisions is provided by the Star Foundation and U.S. Trust.